right, folks, let's get going. My name is David Parsons. You are listening to Nostalgia Trap. Thank you so much for doing so. I hope you enjoy this conversation. I've been wanting to talk to my good friend Andrew Schustek for the last couple weeks about this film, Cure. Cure is a movie that came out in 1997. It's a Japanese horror film directed by Kiyoshi Kurosawa. No relation to Akira Kurosawa. I think we're going to point that out several times in this episode because it is an important distinction. But as we get into this conversation, Andrew watched this film for the first time a couple weeks ago and has watched it a few times subsequently. I first saw this film 20 years ago in an art theater in Los Angeles. Ended up seeing it several times in the theater. Just totally obsessed with this movie. And I think we're both trying to figure out in this episode why. Why is Cure so different? And I think one of the things we get at is that Cure is a film that touches on a lot of the same themes we try to take on Nostalgia Trap, which is the sort of latent violence of populations and how capitalism is a system of hypnosis that sort of links on to those latent tendencies and brings them out. And this is a horror film that explores all of that in a really, really compelling and endlessly terrifying way. So I recommend seeing this film if you haven't. We're obviously going to spoil a lot of it here, but I hope that this episode gets people to see not only Cure, but Kurosawa's other films as well, especially Pulse from 2001, which is about ghosts on the internet. I think this filmmaker is tapped into some really, really important stuff. And as I mentioned, as a young movie nerd, I saw movies a lot, and I was often in the movie theater all day, and I saved all my ticket stubs. So I had all my movie stubs in my wallet, carrying around with me all the time, so I could pop them out at any moment and flick through them and, have a conversation with people, the movies that I liked. That's the kind of dude I was. And the reason why that sticks out to me is because when I was, I guess, like 19 years old in college, I was picked up by the police for what is called a minor in possession. I had a 6-pack of beer that I was carrying down the street, and I didn't have an ID for it. So they handcuffed me and took me into the little local jail. The memory I have of that experience was like how degrading the officers were to me. Like they treated me really shitty. But one of the things they did was they took my wallet out and they found all my movie stubs. And I could hear them in the office, like spreading out all my movie stubs onto the table. And they were sort of laughing at the fact that this guy sees a lot of movies. And look at this. He saw the same movie 2 times, 3 times in one day. And they just found that endlessly funny and endlessly worthy of ridicule. And to me, like, that story really sticks. I'm not sure what conclusion I would draw other than these people were fucking assholes, and it really figured into my growing attitudes about police and my own personal contact with police. But it also seemed to indicate something about movies to me, like my own obsession with movies and how that seemed to be something that was worthy of making fun of, or it was strange to these officers. I don't know. Jesus. Life is trauma, folks, and that's just the way it goes. But I hope you enjoyed this conversation with me and Andrew on Cure. Go see this movie, and let's talk about it. I'd like to hear what you guys think about it, too. All right, here is me and Andrew Schustek talking about Cure. All right, Andrew. Good to see you. How you doing?
Good. It's a little gray in New York City right now, but I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm ready to talk about Cure, man. I've been ready to talk about Cure for 20 fucking years. And you know what? I just want to narrate a little bit of this for our listeners. Like, why are they talking about this film, this Japanese film from 1997 by director Kiyoshi Kurosawa? Not Akira Kurosawa, a very different Kurosawa and someone totally unrelated. If I were him, I would have changed my name to be a filmmaker. But either way, this film, Cure, came out in 97. It didn't come to the United States until 2001, and I'll have something to say about that. But honestly, Andrew, when you texted me that you'd watch this film, and I did not tell you to, I don't think I'd ever mentioned this movie to you, right?
No, it had just been released this month as a new restoration, and there were a few folks on Twitter who were talking about it, and immediately I queued up Criterion, and it was there.
Yeah, I was very excited to watch it again, and very excited to hear that someone else had seen this movie because
Cure Pilled.
Yeah, you got cure pilled, and I think part of the reason why we wanted to talk about this on an episode was we both found that we had so much to say about this movie. And this movie, I will just say, I found first saw this movie in July of 2001. I was looking back of trying to figure out when exactly I saw this, and now I realize I was cure pilled when 9/11 happened. Like
you got mesmered, man.
Exactly. I was living in the San Fernando Valley. I was obsessed with movies. I just graduated from UC Santa Barbara and was in the film studies program. And I was just a person that had almost like an unhealthy obsession with movies. I watched everything that came out, including all the art stuff that came out in LA. And I not only did that, but if there was something that caught my attention that I liked, I would see it a couple times. I remember seeing Memento when it came out 3 times in one day. Like I just spent my whole day in the movie theater watching Memento because and my friend and I, John Fisk. John, if you're out there, my old film buddy, shout out to John Fisk, my long lost friend. We spent a lot of time in the movie theater with notebooks, literally trying to map out Memento, what exactly happened in this film. And Cure was a film like that. And the reason I discovered Cure was because of an article in the LA Times by Kenneth Turin. I don't know why. When I was younger, I thought that Kenneth Turin was some kind of expert on cinema. I was dead fucking wrong. The guy's an idiot. But he had some really good sort of antenna out into the global film world. And that brought it back to me. And so I'm appreciative of these pieces he put out in the late 90s. And then he had a piece about Cure where he was like, look, this movie came out in 1997. This guy Kurosawa has been making movies since 1983. And this is the first opportunity for Americans to see his stuff on the big screen. So I went and saw Cure, honestly, 3-4 times. I couldn't get over it. And I'm trying to sort of piece that together now because I think it was definitely connected to the larger sort of serial killer genre of the 90s and my interest in detective stories and stuff like that. But Cure is something special. And I'm so glad that you watched it last week or a couple weeks ago, and we've been talking about it over text because it's a movie that I still am obsessed with. I had to watch it again. I don't think I've seen it in a couple years, but just watching it again last night and over the course of the last week, I've been kind of dipping into it. It holds up and holds up beyond even my memories of it. It's still, I can honestly say it's one of the greatest pieces of cinema I've ever seen. And I want to figure out why that is. It's a mysterious and very different take on the serial killer story. At the same time, it engages a lot of the same sort of cinematic pleasure centers that I've developed over the years. What was your initial reaction to Cure when you saw this thing?
Well, the detective genre is something that you and your podcast have been playing with for quite some time. I remember an excellent episode with Danny Bessner and Will Menaker discussing LA Confidential. Just to bring that up. And this film, as we'll discuss, plays with many of the tropes and subverts many of the stylings and sort of story structures that a lot of detective movies go about playing with, especially a film we'll get into, David Fincher's Seven, which came out in the 90s as well, sort of in the same conversation of what you mentioned earlier. But my wife is a psychologist, and so she was in the room watching with me briefly as she was working on her own actual psychology. Creeped out a lot, to say the least. But seeing this movie recently, I could not get enough of it. It stayed in my brain, and you were the first person I texted. And so I think what we want to discuss here, and spoiler alert, we're gonna get into the movie pretty heavily here, so please pause this film.
Yeah, if you haven't seen Cure, you can see it on Criterion Channel now.
Yeah.
Which I heartily recommend. I mean, I'm not paid by Criterion Channel to say this, but my life has changed for the better since signing up for them because I don't feel so depressed by the deluge of just streaming garbage that's out there on other platforms. That's not to say that everything on Criterion is awesome, but it just gives you an opportunity to see stuff that you don't really get to see anywhere else. And I've watched so many movies that I don't think I've ever even heard of, let alone been able to watch and study and think about. So Cure, you should definitely see it if you haven't watched
Please
it.
watch.
But what we want to do in this this hour together, Andrew, is sort of think about how to contextualize this movie and how to sort of like figure out what it means to us, because I feel like Cure is compelling from a number of different angles. But like, just for people that haven't seen it, it's a film that is doing something different story wise in terms of its take on serial killing. But also, I think that the thing that stuck out to both you and me is stylistically, it has something going on that's really heavy as well and really unique.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, just to sort of give a brief overview, welcome back if you watched the film. If you haven't, beware. We're going to start talking in depth. It's a very simple plot about a detective, Takabe, who is your detective who's going about trying to solve murders in the city, all taking place with the victims having an X slashed in their chest. And so at the beginning, they find that this is sort of they have a thesis that there might be a copycat killer on the loose, but eventually they run into what we will find out could be the devil. And so I just want to sort of introduce a few topics and theses for discussion here. And I think what you and I spoke about at length is the strong current of political economy running through Cure. And I figured let's start at sort of the 1990s in Japan, and the economic situation in Japan that influences, I think, a lot of the bleak, dark stylings of the film, but also the impulses of many of the characters. And so the film takes place in what we would assume to be 1996, 1997. What is currently happening in Japan is something that economists refer to as the lost decade. Some refer to it as the lost decades, as in we are still in the lost decades. Many economists have argued over the sources and the influences on what that lost decade, sort of how we got there. But just for a brief overview, there's a high stagnation and low growth. And so I'm reminded very much of Marx's quote from the 18th Brumaire about men making their own history. And the reason I bring this up is because he says men make their own history, but they do not do it as they please. They make it under self-selected circumstances and under the circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. And here's the key quote that really reminded me of Cure. The tradition of all dead generations weighs upon a nightmare like of the brains of the living. And so that's the attitude I want to come with as we talk about the murders in Cure and the political economy of the lost decades, because, and this is not just to say, as you said before, we're not just sort of acting on forces of a political economy, but Mamiya, or the devil, is literally conjuring up these sort of dead generations of psychological practices as a waking nightmare on the brains of the living. And so,
does Adam Curtis use that quote? If I heard that quote from Adam Curtis,
oh, you know what, you might be right. Yeah. And so, and he's,
this is totally Adam Curtis territory.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
I'm glad you're getting into the political economy thing, because it's honestly, what's funny is 20 years of watching this movie, I'd never really thought about it. It's funny to say this as like the Nostalgia Trap guy and the guy that does all these political economy episodes about movies and culture, because I always just thought it was like, what a great murder story, what a great story about psychology. I applied other lenses to it. But now that we're thinking about it in terms of like, I don't know, what's going on in Japan, and you can kind of compare it a little bit to, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like there's an analog between 90s Japan and post 2008 the United States, where there's all of a sudden a deep plunge into something that might be a Great Recession or a Great Depression. And you see a sort of acceleration in social violence as a result of that. And a lot that comes out in a lot of different unexpected ways. I think you and I were saying, it's not about the economy creating murderers. More, it's like the political economy sort of unleashing murderers, if that makes sense, or revealing some latent violence at the heart of every human being. And it's not just about poverty; it's about sort of expectations and the way that I was watching here this time with that in mind. And there's a scene right at the beginning. It's one of the more chilling scenes in the whole movie for me, is when Takabe the detective goes to get his dry cleaning, and there is a dude in the dry cleaner, like another customer waiting for his stuff, and he's like sitting there as the dry cleaning lady goes and gets the stuff for him. He like is muttering under his breath, and he's like muttering all this demonic shit, like motherfucker, like if I fucking kill you, like that kind of thing. And there's sort of like when she comes back, he just returns to polite, like, oh, okay, thank you for my laundry, and leaves. And I remember sitting in the theater back in 2001 and thinking, God, that seems like such a key scene, because it feels like it's linking on to almost like the Taxi Driver sense of like everyone is losing their minds here in this society, and everyone's like barely restraining their murderous impulses by putting on this polite mask. And you can feel that slipping at certain moments. And it seems like it makes sense to think of Japan in the 90s as undergoing that kind of slipping moment, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. And to that word link is really key, because the next scene we're introduced to our devil character. But you really struck on something here, and I found a really interesting piece from the Financial Times in 2015 called "The Unseen Casualties of Japan's Lost Decades Suffer in Silence." And so to briefly get at what the author Sahako Kaji is talking about here, he says, "The lost decades have eroded Japan's cherished notion of oneness and harmony. For those with uncertain jobs and futures, they have destroyed a sense of purpose. The suicide rate, which rose sharply when economic stagnation set in the late 1990s, is 60% higher than the world average."
Wow.
Sahako then goes on to talk about those who suffer the effects of the lost decades do so quietly. Except for isolated violent outbursts by dissatisfied employees or desperate youths, the sporadic anti-nuclear demonstrations, the streets are calm. The crime rate has even fallen. The general sense of peace, though, may disguise a dangerous turbulence below the surface. And so this is the Financial Times we're talking about here, the political economy newspaper of choice for, I'm sure, a lot of your listeners and myself. And so Sahako continues to talk about the sort of low growth as a plague on society, where the costs of Medicare were going up, Social Security is going up, and how sort of there's a culture among youth who don't listen to older folks, and especially politicians. And so looking at suicide rates in the 1990s, I found a really interesting jump from 1990 to 1995 to 2000. And most of this jump is carried by men. I then looked at the murder rate in Japan. And in the 1990s, we see a trend of the murder rate going down. But there was a jump from 1996 to 1998. And it's hard to disassociate that from the film taking place in 1997.
Yeah.
The birth rate famously has gone down. Since the 1950s, which is a subject of much discussion in various outlets. And I have an interesting stat here that the number of births in Japan plummeted to its lowest levels on record in 2020 as coronavirus accelerated, while the number of marriages fell. And so there's been a path where the U.S. is actually mirroring Japan on the low birth rate. So I think we've discussed at length, and maybe you could take it from here, the sort of ways that there's a dialectical relationship between Japan and the U.S. And I would really encourage your listeners to go back to an episode you and Justin did, The Political Economies of Mass Shooting, and ponder whether this movie would take place in the United States, and if so, how it would be carried out with guns, as opposed to Japan, where, according to the BBC, as of 2017, Japan has almost eradicated gun crime because guns are banned. There is basically no gun violence in Japan. And so there are ways that we could sort of twin this movie with a movie like Seven, which you discussed earlier, of an American detective story. But these things have a relationship.
Yeah.
Sort of. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel that, and we did something. We do it bigger in America. We have spectacular mass shootings that it'd be interesting to look at the mass shootings since 2008. I feel like the Obama years were just filled with it, right? I could be wrong, but I think that was like the most concentrated period of that type of mass violence. But I'm also thinking about the act of terrorism, the sarin gas attack that happened in 1995, which for those who want to read more about that, there's a lot to read. But I wanted to point everyone to this book by Haruki Murakami, who's mostly known by Americans for his novels. But Murakami wrote a nonfiction book, this one right here, called Underground, the Tokyo gas attack and the Japanese psyche. And what's interesting about this book is it's, sort of an oral history. He talks to a lot of people that were involved in this. And part of the idea for this book was that Murakami wanted to investigate this in a way that he felt that Japanese media had not. He felt like the ordinary people who had been the victims of the gas attack had been sort of left behind, and he thought that their stories were important, not just to recover, the pain and trauma that they went through, but to recover the sort of feeling of living in a society that doesn't really deal with things on the surface this way. It felt like, or underneath the surface, and a lot of things are hidden, and it feels like. I'm glad you sort of pointed out this kind of connection between American society and Japanese society, especially in the post-World War II era, right? That there is this not only psychological connection and cultural one, but it's a practical military alliance as well. I mean, there's a lot going on there, and that the idea of sort of sublimated violence as parts of these imperial societies. And it was very familiar to me. And reading Murakami's book, it's hard not to think about Americans who are really desperate to not look stuff in the face and kind of move on. Isolate the violence. Have your your candlelight vigils for all the mass shootings and stuff, but never really sort of take a step back and look at how we're producing this. I know that our conversation about this mass violence in America is what often reduced to guns, right? Like you mentioned, gun control is one part of it. Mental illness seems to be the other. And maybe we can get into that because it's Cure, watching it now after having seen it in the pre 9/11, pre Great Recession. It's really prophetic in a lot of ways of the kind of felt reality of a society that's doing that. And the mental illness part of it, it shows up in Cure in very literal ways, right? Like it shows up in really
Takabe's wife.
Yeah, it's hard not to miss that. And in fact, when I was talking to Claudia about this movie, because we watched Cure years ago and she still remembers it. It's something that made a big impression on her. One of the things she remembered most about the movie was not the gruesome murders, but the atmosphere in Takabe's house, in which there is a wife who's suffering from mental illness and it comes out in a really kind of horrifying and maybe even banal way, and maybe that's why it's horrifying. She turns on the washing machine with nothing in it. And there's this sound, and here's where we get into I think Kurosawa's brilliance as a filmmaker and how he uses these formal elements to produce a feeling within the viewer. But God, how do you like that apartment, Andrew? That droning sound. I mean, what does that do for you? And maybe you can say something about mental illness, because I know you were thinking about that too.
Yeah.
In the context of this isn't. It's funny because the mentally ill part doesn't really come necessarily from the killer, who seems like he's maybe the most fucked up dude, but also the most like sort of like lucid and in control.
He's the most in control character in the film, arguably.
Yeah.
And it's worth noting that the film opens on Takabe's wife, and what she's doing is she's sitting with her presumed doctor, psychologist in a facility, a doctor's office, some sort of mental health clinic, and she's the one who's caring and loving throughout the film. And just to sort of reference the sound editing you were discussing before in the apartment, one of the most incredible cuts in the film is when Takabe is imagining his wife's death, and then immediately cuts to the sound of the blender of her making the smoothie in the apartment. It's a jarring example of this amazing sort of latent, but also sort of background hum and buzz of electronics. And it's worth noting the economy, the consumer economy that the United States shares a relationship with in Japan is predicated on a lot of the production of electronics and technology. There's a lot of that, and instead of a formal score, there's a lot of sort of buzzing of what we might associate with machinery. And so this sort of theme of mental illness is important to note because U.S. and international research shows that the idea that the mentally ill are killing us is completely false. Completely false. And so I have a stat here that in the United States, and it's hard to get the stat for Japan, but approximately those who have bipolar or schizophrenia are responsible for about 10% of homicides in the United States. So what that means is those without it are responsible for 90%. And so there's this sort of discussion whenever we discuss gun control or murders in this country, especially that we just need to invest in mental health. Of course, who's going to argue against that? It's vital. However, what Cure is gesturing towards is that those who aren't mentally unwell are those who are most primed to possibly carry out murder or suicide.
Yeah, and I mean that seems like, now that you point that out, that seems like kind of an obvious thesis for the film, actually, because I mean for those that haven't seen the film, what the plot is that there are these murders happening, but there's not a single perpetrator. The people who are killing their wives or just random people around them and carving this X into them are just ordinary people who like afterwards are in some sort of trance, and they're like, I don't know what happened to me. I don't know why I did this. It just seemed like the natural thing to do. Like so many of them, one of the most disturbing is the guy that kills his wife and he's like wrapped in a sheet. It reminds me actually of Seven, the guy that the lust one, where the guy is like wrapped in the sheet and he's just like, why did this happen to me? Like, why did this happen to me? And he's like really struggling to like kind of wrap his mind around the act that he was sort of forced to do, I guess. But the movie has to do with hypnosis. And it has to do with a character named, what we eventually meet, named Mamiya, who is, it turns out, has encountered all of these people before they committed their murders. And even though they can't remember it, the detective figures it out, that they've all made contact with this one creepy dude. And that creepy dude ends up being the character that is maybe implanting these ideas in people's minds. And you mentioned that shot of the detective coming home and like seeing his wife hanging in the kitchen, which is so fucking insane. Like that whole sequence to me is one of the most freaky elements of the whole production. But if you remember, doesn't Mamiya say to him later, like, he says, like, you saw your dead wife, didn't you?
Yeah.
Like Mamiya seems to know that the detective saw that. I'm like, how does this guy fucking know that? Is this like a supernatural film to you, Andrew? Would you classify it that way?
Well,
I know we're talking about political economy.
There's no such thing that is a divorce from political economy, and
even the supernatural.
Of course, yeah. And it's not. First, I would sort of gesture back to that Marx quote from the 18th Brumaire about sort of the dead living with us and how we're acting upon sort of the ways that past society influences us. But it's worth maybe thinking about whether Mamiya was in that videotape himself in the 1900s or the 1800s. in that videotape that his partner psychologist shows him doing the mesmer technique. But this
like a goddamn vampire through
right,
centuries.
Nosferatu. Yeah, but there's it's worth mentioning that this film comes out a year before Ringu, the Japanese version of The Ring in America, and so that itself is another piece of art with a thesis that there's something supernatural about technology, whether it's the videotape or the technology of literal psychology itself, the technology to push us to murder, be murdered, commit murder against ourselves. There's a real dialectical relationship between sort of the dead and the living in this film, and that is sort of best exemplified by Takabe's feverish sort of nightmare, but also fantasies of his wife dying. And whether or not she is, at some of them she's killed herself, and others maybe he's the one who has killed her. Maybe Mamiya has been the one who's killed her.
That's a really great point. Takabe is like angry the whole fucking movie. Like he's pissed, and he's explicitly pissed about his situation with his wife. He's like, and he seems to like when he finally like kind of talks to Mamiya, and he seems to know like this guy's gonna fucking try to hypnotize me. One of the things that Mamiya does is like he pulls out a lighter, and like flicks the lighter, and the lighter is sort of his device for mesmerizing people. And like Takabe knows this. Like he comes to when he sees Mamiya, he slaps the lighter out of his hand. And like, what's the matter? You don't want your lighter? But what's amazing is that he can also use like water, spilled water and cups of water to like get you. But what's amazing about it, and I want to get back to your point about that because I never really thought about it this way. Takabe's pissed. Like he immediately starts telling Mamiya, like, you know what? Like I fucking have tried with my wife. I've tried, and she makes my life miserable because she's sick, and all I have to do is take care of her, and that's what my whole life is. And he's almost like pushing back against Mamiya's sort of like hypnosis. The way that Mamiya's gonna hook him is not in other words, it's not Mamiya just being like, I'm gonna make you a murderer. It's like Mamiya saying, I'm gonna find the thing inside of you that like is the root of a murder that you might commit, and I'm going to accelerate that impulse. And it seems like, I mean, that's capitalism, in a really broad way. The idea that here's this thing that like knows you better than you know yourself, and is like, hey, I know you take care of your wife, but you probably want to kill her, don't you? And like that's why Takabe is so fucking pissed, and why he's slapping the lighter out of his hand and saying like, no, I try to take care of my wife, because he seems to know that Mamiya has his number. And that's so fucking horrifying that capital is like telling you, we know better than you who you are. You want to kill this girl. You want to do this. You want to unleash whatever carnal desire you have within yourself. God, what a fucking scary thought. Thank you for laying that out, Andrew.
No, well, two points here. One, there is a fantastic Vimeo film essay by a channel called Under the Bed Films. I encourage everyone to go take a watch.
I love those video essays. Those are so
they're
fun.
great.
Yeah,
it's called Cure, or How to Be Happy While Saving the Species. And his thesis here, one of his theses that he lays out, is that there's Takabe's obsession with death is what's drawing him closer to be a mesmer or a murderer, and that love, the dialectical opposition to murder, should he had embraced it, may have cured him. However, I just want to note two things here. One, it doesn't. The thesis that resonated with me the most in this video essay was that it doesn't matter if he actually killed Takabe or his wife, or if Takabe kills anybody or his wife, or he kills Mamiya. What matters is the possibility that he might. And that's the sort of undercurrent throughout the whole film. And to get back to what you were just saying before, who reminds you of another detective film in which a main character is being thrust into killing, which is against supposedly his moral code? You're reminding me of Brad Pitt in Seven, but you're also encouraging me to remember the Joker in The Dark Knight.
Yeah.
And tonight, you're going to break your one rule. And so we've been discussing
I knew
earlier.
Christopher Nolan would make an appearance eventually.
He always does. He always does. And so we had been discussing earlier the similarities between this film and Seven and The Dark Knight. And Seven is stylistically an opposition to Cure, whereas Seven, as the video essay notes, and I really encourage everyone to watch it, the editing and the action sequences of story propelling you forward is what sort of drives the plot. Whereas in Cure, everything is filmed from a distance, and you are sort of left to ponder your own place within the story. But I just really want to make this quick point about The Dark Knight, and I would say that there are so many similarities between the two films. And you see a connection to Nolan's Joker in the sense that this character is looking to reveal some sort of truth about society and our base instincts to turn on each other and kill one another. And the interrogation scene you talk about with
where are they?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost the same thing. The devil character is sort of playing calm while the detective explodes, and as the Joker says, madness, as you know, is like gravity. Sometimes all it takes is a push. And so there's a little dialectical push and pull between sanity and insanity. And in Cure, that madness is defined as something else, which is simmering underneath. But both of those characters are acting in a political economy. And so both of those films, I think, are saying when the moment is right, people can be pushed.
Yeah. And the Joker as depicted by Heath Ledger in that movie is definitely the guy that's sort of teasing with this thesis. And isn't that the whole thing with the boats? Mm-hmm. In that movie is that the Joker is setting up like an equation, and he's made the wager that people, I mean, he has a dark vision of humanity. He's made the wager that underneath there's something really ugly just wanting to come out, and we just need to send a push in that direction. I'm glad you mentioned the stylistic part of this, because this movie, for those who haven't seen Kurosawa's movies, and I'm talking about Kiyoshi Kurosawa, I watched his other movie Pulse, and which came out in 2001 in Japan, and is even more so playing with this aesthetic of letting you sit and watch a static frame for a while, and all of a sudden you notice that there's something present in the frame that you didn't realize was there before, and that's where like the root of the terror comes from. So in other words, a lot of it is about sort of giving the viewer an opportunity to kind of sit in these spaces and sort of be mesmerized in the same way as the characters are being mesmerized, but then realizing that like something else is going on right in front of you. I mean, it gets back to all that political economy stuff we were saying, which is that it looks like a banal scene, and maybe society looks banal from a certain perspective, but that if you look closer, I'm doing the American Beauty thing, look closer, there's something else happening there. And in terms of just the like practical elements of filmmaking here, I don't know if you've seen like Hereditary. Have you seen that movie?
Yeah.
The scariest scenes in that film to me, and I don't know what people think of that filmmaker, but the scariest scenes in Hereditary.
It's Ari Aster. Is that right? Ari Aster.
Ari Aster.
He directed Midsommar, which I thought was incredible.
I know your mom loves that movie.
Shout out to my mom.
And he does that. He does it in Midsommar too. But like at the end of Hereditary, there's a shot where the main teenage kid is like in his bed, and like his mom is like floating up in the ceiling, and I didn't realize it was happening. I was sitting watching that frame for a while, and when I realized it, I mean, that's probably one of the deepest, like darkest, most like tingly scares I've gotten from an American movie in a long time. And I'm like, fuck, even this is stolen from Japanese horror. Like Japanese horror to me, and I don't know, I'm speaking for myself here. I don't know if you feel this way or listeners feel this way, But Japanese horror films just absolutely destroy me, and actually, in terms of how scary they are. A lot of people don't find films scary at all, but I'm very invested in them. And I find myself often like genuinely horrified by certain movies that I guess like Cure that kind of activate a part of the imagination, and that's part of what he does. I wanted to read this quote from the God Martin Scorsese, who we love him on this show, and he's sort of a father figure to me, honestly. There's a lot going on there. He's a daddy for sure. But he talked about Kiyoshi Kurosawa and had like a really cool attitude about it. He said this. Here's Martin Scorsese on Kiyoshi Kurosawa. He says, "This is," and he's talking about Cure, by the way. "This is one of the very best films by the extremely talented Kiyoshi Kurosawa. For those of you who don't know the name or the work, he's no relation to Akira Kurosawa. He's an absolute master of light, framing, and pacing, and he has so much control over all three that there are moments in his movies when the slightest gesture in the corner of the frame will send a shiver down your spine." Along with Pulse, which is about ghosts on the internet. There's your technology, Andrew. Cure is his most terrifying movie. The excellent Koji Yakusho, he and Kurosawa have worked together many times, is a detective confronted with a seemingly inexplicable phenomenon. A series of murders in which the perpetrators are standing by unaware of how or why they did it, with red X's carved on the necks of the victims. There are startling images and moments in this picture that will haunt you for a long time to come, and I suppose I should say that it's not for the faint of heart. But be brave, because it's worth it. Kurosawa is a major filmmaker. I couldn't agree more, Marty. And honestly, it was seeing Cure in 2001 after I had just gone through a film program in which I took actual like authorship classes on Scorsese, and we read about New York and did tour stuff, that like I was well prepared to love this movie by Scorsese in some ways, even though Scorsese doesn't really do this style ever. Like he doesn't do these like long static shots where things emerge from the frame. But I think he kind of like I think does different things with the camera, but it's the spirit of this film that really links up with what I appreciated about Scorsese more than anything else, which is the spirit of like using all the tools of cinema to give us some sort of interrogation of what it's like to be human. And this movie Cure, I mean, it's Japanese horror film, but it seems like a lot more than that, doesn't it? Like that's why we're talking about it. It seems like it's on another level. I'm trying to figure out like how do we articulate why and how it's on this other level, because it is something that to me is like the movie to go back to throughout my life to sort of refresh and remember whatever Kurosawa was trying to tell us in this movie. Yeah,
and Scorsese is a deeply internationalist student of film, and so
spiritual. He does spirituality a lot.
Very much so. It's interesting always seeing the capital D discourse around Scorsese on sort of social media networks that you have a lot of folks who don't understand sort of only a few of his movies dealt with the mob, and most of them deal with sort of spirituality and God and godlessness and the human condition. And I would argue all those mafia movies are exactly in that same theme as well. But I think if we want to discuss why the movie resonates so much, I think it's because we can recognize so much of capitalist alienation in the film. And so
definitely, yeah.
And to say,
I didn't have words for that when I was so geared into the cinema elements of this, which are just on point, that I think it's easy to sort of miss that sort of intervention in capitalism. I told you I watched Pulse. I mean, Pulse is not like Cure in the same way, but it's still playing with. I mean, it's because it's kind of a more obvious movie. It's more like The Ring, like a haunted computer type thing. It does sort of reinforce what you're saying here, which is that this is a movie about capitalism.
Yeah, and the preeminent filmmaker of our time, arguably one of them, Bong Joon-ho, says that this is in the top 10 films he's ever seen in his life, and that it is one of the major influences on Parasite. And he actually showed it.
Cure and Parasite, right? I mean, it just seems like pretty obvious.
Well, there's that sort of, yeah. And so he actually got his own film series at the Lincoln Center, I think a few years ago, when Parasite was getting a lot of attention during its Oscar run, and showed it as one of the feature films.
I didn't know that.
At the Lincoln Center as part of The Bong Show, a series of films that he chose. And he's gone on record as saying that this is one of the most important films that has influenced him, and it's one of his favorites. And I think getting back to sort of the political economy, we could get to the sort of gendered and the gendered murders of the film. And we could talk about the class composition of the murderers and those who were murdered. And I think we could also talk a little bit about mind control and statecraft.
Yeah, I mean, what do we do with the gender angle? I mentioned that, for those that don't remember the 90s, there was a little movie called Silence of the Lambs that came out and just fucking dominated everything in the early 90s. I think that came out in 91. It won every Academy Award, and I was obsessed with that movie. I was only 13 years old, but it's kind of like a perfect movie for a 13-year-old, I think. Silence of the Lambs. But it gave birth to a whole genre of serial killer movies throughout the 90s. Some of them really terrible, some of them not so terrible, but including Seven, I think, which is one of the best of that genre. But it seemed like there was sort of a deep interest in like dead girls and figuring out dead girls. I mean, I would even put Twin Peaks in there, right?
Totally. And speaking of Silence of the Lambs, I would say it's before the 90s, but 1986, Michael Mann's Manhunter.
Yeah, for sure.
The first Hannibal Lecter film, which I think is just incredible.
Well, I mean, David Lynch even plays with this in like the subtitle for Inland Empire is A Woman in Trouble, right? There's this sort of like, if you are making a piece of art, which is also a capitalist product, which would be a Hollywood movie, a way to, you want to engage sentiment, and you want to, in the same way that Mamiya wants to mesmerize you by drawing out the things that you're interested in and the things that are sort of like laying in the subconscious. It seems like the fact that Hollywood wants to like show you stories about girls being murdered and men sort of like conflicted men sort of rescuing them from that or avenging them in some way. I mean, I wonder if we would say that this genre is aimed at men and aimed at their like sort of pleasure centers, because I mean, we even talked about that with Matt Christman the first time he was on the show. The sort of like idea of justified violence being very appealing, especially to young men who are forming their identity and sort of forming their identity by rescuing the weak in some way. And like not only rescuing the weak, but then like being sort of justified in committing egregious acts of violence because you're the good guy. And you know, they play with that pretty deeply at the end of Seven, right? Because he's like, who is he really rescuing there at the end? Like when Brad Pitt is got the gun aimed at John Doe there, and thinking about Gwyneth Paltrow, who's already dead. There's no one to rescue. Like Brad Pitt just blows his brains out because it feels like, quote unquote, the natural thing to do. And I wonder how many like dudes watch that and are like, yeah, like I'd fucking do it too. Like in other words, like it almost feels like the film is asking you to consider how you feel about that at the end there, you know? And like, I think Fincher is smart enough, a director, to sort of leave it in our hands and be like, here, you deal with this. How do you feel about Brad Pitt pulling the trigger on John Doe at the end? Because it's identified as a crime. He's like going to probably go to jail for it. But at the same time, I think a lot of people walk away from that film and are like, well, he had to do it, or it was the right thing. And Cure seems like it's playing with that very deeply. This sort of idea that like, well, sometimes murder can seem like a very natural, almost moral thing to do, and what kind of system can produce that? I don't know. That's part of what I'm getting from that. And I know the 90s like murder genre was bigger, but I remember when The Cell came out, and The Cell is a film that's like very I don't know. I haven't seen it in a long time. I think it was a lame movie, but it had like a lot of like really cool sets and like costumes, and Vincent D'Onofrio looked really cool in all his like different devil outfits. But that movie was like kind of gross. I felt like in that it was so just like about how creatively this guy could like rip women's skin off and like do whatever evil shit he was doing. And I felt like we'd sort of like drop the plot in some way and just sort of were reveling in the serial killer's creative ways of killing girls. But maybe I'm hearing Justin's voice now in my head. Maybe movies like The Cell like reveal the project more than any other of like what all this shit is really about.
To bring it back to Scorsese, I'm reminded of the way that he frames his mob movies. The point of romanticizing, quote unquote, the mafia, as many, I think people who are missing the point claim that Scorsese does, is he's showing you how easy it is to be brought into that world. And like Seven, you're asking yourself, could I be taken in by a charming mafioso man? Could I find myself in a life of crime? It's, by these charming people. Could I be lured in by money, by fame, by sex, by drugs, by all of that? And the reason why those movies are so resonant and effective is because you question whether that's true or not, whether your humanity, could you be driven to kill? Could you be driven to do these things that you see in whether it's Goodfellas or Casino, et cetera, et cetera.
Dude, I'm thinking about Taxi Driver. I mean, isn't a Taxi Driver about like a guy that's trying to rescue a woman, and like he's got this message from the culture that that's the right thing to do.
Right.
It feels like that movie is definitely intervening in the same way on kind of like what is it that creates that impulse, and how does that impulse connect to violence?
Right, and to connect it to Cure, what Cure is asking the viewer, and quite literally because of the way it's shot, because of the way that the sound design works, because of the way that you are an active participant in watching the film unfold, not just watching a series of edits that propel a story forward.
Yes.
You are quite literally asking yourself, could I be mesmered, for lack of a better verb there, to be driven to murder? Could this happen to me?
Yeah.
And the answer is maybe. And that's what's so chilling about the film. And that's why it's so interesting and effective. And to get back to the political economy of the film, I think we wanted to discuss some of the ways that the film uses gender and sex here. And there's a push and pull on this, the role that women play in murder stories, whether it's as a victim, but we can sort of get into what I think this movie is clearly discussing as femicide, the sort of perpetrator in the interesting case of the doctor who's spurred on to murder once she's mesmered. But we open on a prostitute being murdered. And as we all know, it's just like a classic film trope, but like prostitution is the most dangerous profession in the country, I believe. It's up there. And I have some stats here that according to recent statistics in the US, the death rate for prostitutes is 204 out of every 100,000. For fishermen, which is known as like a very dangerous field, it's 129. And so on average, the average prostitute gets physically but not lethally assaulted approximately once a month. And so the next person we see murdered is that of the teacher's wife. She's a homemaker in what I believe appears to be some sort of like working class house. Her husband is the one who is mesmered into murdering her and then throwing himself out of a window. But it's interesting to note there, the sort of domestic violence taking place in the home, coming from partners. The call is coming from inside the house.
Right.
Yeah. But then we go to the doctor, and it's interesting that the woman who is sort of outside of the class position of like working class or poor, we can assume the prostitute is probably not someone we would consider upper middle class, but sort of a doctor, which is associated with higher incomes globally, is the one who is driven to murder. And the thing that pushes her is Mamiya's discussion about her role as a woman in the workplace. How, you don't feel respected as a woman. professionally, personally. And this is the scene right before he comes in is her checking up on a man who sort of has this like weird vibe where he cracks a joke about her asking him to take his pants off while she's examining him. Super gendered. And so I think with someone as intentional as Kurosawa, he's making a pretty direct statement about the way that gender operates in the workplace and in the home through social reproduction. And so
that's a great point. Like, it's true. And I'm thinking about that scene. I mean, that scene with the doctor is so chilling because that's where you learn. I think that's the scene where you sort of like learn how skilled Mamiya is at mesmerizing people, right? And he asks if he can smoke, and you're like, oh shit, he's gonna take his lighter out, but she says no, you can't. And it's like, okay, she's in control in this context. She's got a level of control, and he's like, oh okay, and he sort of like wanders over to the sink and turns the water on, and uses the glass of water, and eventually he spills it. And the sequence of cuts, I mean, you want to do like a master class in how to create this sort of horror and tension. I mean, it's like a series of cuts with the water and with her face and him talking. And when it's like this quick cut, I don't know if you noticed it, like a quick cut back to Mamiya, and he's like now like on the other side of the room, like lounging against the wall, and he says, "Don't look at me," and it cuts immediately back. Like it's like a 1 second shot. He just says, "Don't look at me." But I love the point you just made, Andrew, because I think it is key to kind of uncovering the gender element of what Kurosawa was doing with this movie Cure, which is, when he talks to men, he's engaging like, you want to kill your wife, right? Like, you want to kill your wife, don't you? And when he talks to this woman, he's engaging misogyny and saying like, don't you resent misogyny? He's almost saying like, don't you resent men and like that they want to kill you? Don't you want to do something about that? Don't you feel afraid? And he mesmerizes her using the context of her it's like latent resentment of her gendered position in capitalism. God, that's so good. There's your
dialectic. Yeah,
these are such great movies, dude. And you know what I wanted to ask you before I forget, the title of the film. We mentioned Bong's movie Parasite, which is, God, dude, there were so many people that were like, what's the parasite? Who are the parasites? And like kind of like, do you not? I mean, for me, like I don't want to make it so simple to say like, oh, Bong was saying the parasite is capitalism. But it seems pretty obvious. I mean, I talked to people, including students, who said the parasites are the people who come live in your home and like say they're going to be your maid and take care of you, but instead they're going to like kill you. And I was like, what? Like,
well, there's a good example of how, art is sort of in the eye of the beholder.
That's
Someone
right.
with a right-wing framing could come into it.
That's right. And I shouldn't be saying there's a right answer to any of this shit, but to me, my reading of Parasite was a little bit different. But the movie Cure, or the title Cure, what do you get from that title? Because I'd never really thought about it all that much. Like the title of the film Cure was just sort of incidental to me. And I thought, okay, I hadn't really kind of unpacked it.
Yeah. What's funny is I found an interview from 2018. Kurosawa himself says that the original title was The Missionary.
Ooh.
And we can assume that could be
I just got a chill down my spine, dude. This movie freaks me out. I think that's part of, maybe it freaks me out because it feels like real in some way. Like it's such a weird thing to say about a movie that's about a guy that hypnotizes people into murder, but it seems like, no, this is the real deal right here. This is how shit works.
And the article itself says that that title, The Missionary, evokes a religious or cult-like feeling that would have been timely considering the poisonous gas attack in the subway in the Tokyo subways carried out by the Aum Shinrikyo, and I apologize if I got that name wrong, the cult 2 years earlier.
Yeah.
And so
the leader of that cult looks like Mamiya. I don't know if you've seen.
Oh, no.
He's like a long-haired dude. They executed him in 2018 along with 6 others who were involved. But there was the discourse in Japan about that guy was that he was mesmerizing people. He had hypnotized people into doing these things. Yeah.
Yeah, that for me, I think there could be multiple interpretations of the title, but one of the ones that keeps making me laugh is this sort of ironic, distanced view on the Cure being mesmered, which to me is I don't think it's the intentional title.
Oh, like the Cure is being mesmerized.
Yeah. And so I think it's a very evocative title that I think could be open for multiple interpretations. But I think, like the way that the film is shot, it is sort of designed to give you a sense of ironic and distanced and melancholic dread. So that's my take on the title. To me, it's almost like it doesn't matter if there's a specific interpretation.
Well, I wondered how you would respond to this because I thought that I was thinking about the ending of this movie and sort of what happens. First of all, as I think reading Will Menaker's review on Letterboxd,
he wrote a fantastic review.
Yeah, love Will's reviews on Letterboxd. He identified one of the greatest things about this movie, which is that it has one of the greatest and most evocative and horrifying and most technically incredible final shots of any film that I can recall. And in fact, that's the thing I thought about the most. Like, I remember going back and seeing this film 3 times in one day, and just like I started breathing a little bit differently and started sweating when I realized we were going to watch that final scene and that final shot, because I didn't want to blink. I didn't want to miss like how it put a choke in me. Like I was going to gag at the end with how scary and amazing and thematically incredible that last shot is. But it's also somewhat like mysterious and sort of like, what the fuck is going on? Because for those, I'm spoiling the end here, but Takabe eventually does what he should have fucking done at the beginning, which is put a million bullets into this fucking guy. And he kills the guy, okay? And he kills Mamiya. But before he administers the final headshots, as these detectives often end up doing in movies, Mamiya reaches up with his hand and makes the X symbol in the air. And like the last thing you see him do is that bloody hand making the X. It actually, doesn't it remind you of the last shots of Taxi Driver, where he's killing himself with his hand, like pulling the trigger with his like bloody hand and his fingers. There's so much going on there, but he makes that X, and like when I watched it this time, I was cursing the detective, and I was like, "You dumb asshole! You should have shot this guy before he had a chance to make that X symbol, because now he just put he put the mesmer juice on you. He cure pilled you, and now you got it." And indeed, in the final shot of the film, the detective seems to have passed this on to the waitress at the diner, and that's that final shot of her sort of wandering off into the distance, and the shot continuing, and you kind of keep seeing her, and she grabs a knife, and like it's the glint of the knife against the light that like puts the film out for you and sends you back into the darkness where the credits are. And to me, it's just like the most astounding ending of a film. But I wonder what you think about this quote from the Kenneth Turin's review. God bless him. I'm sorry I shit on him earlier. But Kenneth Turin in the LA Times in the his July 27th, 2001 review, he says this: "Perhaps what is most distinctive about Cure is that although it solves the crimes, its resolution offers us none of the genuine peace we ordinarily expect, no sense that anything has really been resolved. Can mere knowledge make a difference against pervasive hopelessness? Can the forces of order ever be a fair match for the power of the unconscious? With its gift for infusing uneasiness into every frame, Kurosawa's moody, unnerving film continues to spook us even after the lights have gone on."
Yeah.
Isn't that a great quote?
That is one of my all-time favorite endings, and I would also put it in the context of sort of other endings of other final shots of movies that make us contemplate whether we're capable to being driven to murder, such as Midsommar, which is the final shot of Florence Pugh's face smiling as she realizes she has a family and that she's murdered her boyfriend, and The Thing, in which the two final characters at the end are sort of left there wondering if one of the other is the thing and whether they'll be driven to murder each other. And also, of course, unmatched, but The Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3. Well, I'm just kidding. But that's also my favorite ending of any final shot of any movie.
I'm thinking of a filmmaker that I've really appreciated the two films he's done so far. I think he's only done two. Robert Eggers, who made
forget it.
The Witch and The Lighthouse.
Forget it. Unbelievable.
And the final shot of The Witch is much like the final shot of Midsommar in that it's the main character, the girl who is like now sort of I guess been brought into living deliciously. And she's floating up above the clouds, and she has this really like pleasant, smile upon her face as she's like being sworn into the coven of witches. And it's just like, whoa, it really leaves you with something. And I feel like Cure does that. I mean, how did you read the ending of this film? Like, did it feel like that? Do you think that the detective got Cure pilled?
Oh, absolutely.
He's now
we carrying, are as well.
Yeah.
I think the viewer has been cure pilled. Takabe has been cure pilled.
That's right. The X is sort of at us.
Yeah.
Fuck, man.
And throughout the film, you'll notice that there are various scenes in which there's a sort of background light and elemental, sort of the fire and water, not to get too Marxist again, dialectic of fire and water, but there's these elemental, for lack of a better word, elements around us that are sort of drawing us near the water and the fire. To go to that ending, I did want to sort of, I had to watch it twice. That shot of the waitress holding the knife, I was like, wait, what?
I'm so glad I can watch this streaming now and just like isolate certain shots, because I had to go back to the beginning to recognize that, and this is why I went back and saw it in the theater 3 times, but like to see like certain things like on the beach, which we both noticed this time, like this motherfucker in the sequence of shots that Kurosawa sets up, he communicates with the language of cinema. He communicates the sort of like supernatural, spontaneous appearance of this guy. This guy just fucking manifests on an empty beach, and it's like it's not done with any goddamn special effect or any like Marvel ass squib shot. So it's fucking just done with cuts, and it is so fucking effective, and it works on a subconscious level. And I had to go back and look at it and see what he was actually doing there. But yeah, back to the ending. I'm sorry.
Oh no, absolutely. It reminds me of the way that Tarkovsky in Stalker is able to sort of so effectively draw you in just by changing the color from the USSR to the zone by just turning the color from sepia to normal, which is just freaky. An incredible cut. But in that scene where we're introduced to him, the way that the scene is shot is just this amazing editing where we see the empty beach from a distance, empty and desolate. And it feels like Mars, honestly, the way that the sort of red, brown, sort of desolate shot of the beach. And so you see the teacher character, and then you have that same shot of the beach from his point of view, but in the middle of the frame is the devil, sort of the same quick cuts that you were talking about earlier.
He's kind of like writhing around. It's so fucking scary. God, that guy scares the shit out of me.
There's a physicality to the performance and an intimacy in which he mesmers all of his subjects, so to speak, that is, dare I say, queer. And
what do you mean by that? I think you're right. I mean, there's an intimacy to something that he does there.
He is not only getting spiritually close, but physically close to these men and women in a way that feels bigger and more latent with an eroticism than would be thought of in your normal sort of picture in your head, a psychologist and a patient. There's
he's
the way that
penetrating.
he's squirming. Absolutely.
And he doesn't he say to the doctor, he's like, I used to be full, but now like I'm empty, and like I can put that inside of you, and I can see inside of you. Like there's a lot of that kind of like transference of.
Yes, he says, I was once full, but what was inside me is outside now. And I think you could read that sort of splashing the water on the doctor and then saying, don't look at me. One might sort of interpret that as sort of a post-coital shame, or sort of post-coital just interaction. It's charged with a very intimate sexual sort of, it's an assault. And I think one could read it as a sexual assault. And I think what he's doing to all these people can be read as sexual assault in sort of a very intimate way. There's the physicality of it. There's the intimacy of the mind. And so he feels like as his partner says, he refers to him as sort of a devil, like, maybe the devil made him do it, to all these folks who end up being murderers. And we've discussed, before we get back to the ending being bookended by the beginning, I just wanted to make sure we sort of hit on this sort of theme of mind control, and sort of to connecting it back to a larger political economy of what reminded us both of sort of the projects around MK Ultra, which notably had its failures. The ability to sort of create someone who could murder at will, and
the Manchurian candidate shit.
Yeah, exactly. There are numerous stories you could look to that Adam Curtis himself, as you discussed earlier, has sort of gotten into. But the way that those projects are failures, as the psychologist himself says, like, you can't just get someone to murder someone if they don't want to be doing it. And so that's what really leads us to the thesis throughout the film, that like, well, maybe there is something that makes them want to do it. So I'm reminded of MK Ultra and the failures and successes of the Chaos program. And I would refer everybody to go back to your episode of called Chaos, I believe, with Justin Rogers Cooper, about this very idea of mind control. And but to get back to the ending, before I know I'm going to wrap up shortly, and sort of connecting it back to capitalism as the cure, capitalism as the sort of mesmering force. It's most endings like to be sort of gesture towards beginnings. And I think we could look to the beginning of the first shot of the film, and it is Takabe's wife. And she's in the doctor's office reading Bluebeard, which is, according to Wikipedia, the tale of a story of a wealthy man in the habit of murdering his wives and the attempts of one wife to avoid the fate of her predecessors. The verb bluebearding has even appeared as a way to describe the crime of either killing a series of women or seducing and abandoning a series of women. There's femicide off the bat of this movie.
Yeah, you're right. It's the pirate story she's telling at the beginning. Yep.
And so that ending is just incredible and gestures us towards the beginning with a woman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
and it also seems like Momiya is like a metaphor for cinema itself. Like being mesmerized is watching movies. Like there's something going on there with that part of it. And I don't know if you've heard of a cultural phenomenon referred to as autonomous sensory meridian response, better known as ASMR, which got really popular on YouTube in the last many, many years. And I had to sort of look up when I first started seeing these ASMR videos, which are, have you watched any of these, Andrew? You know what I'm talking about?
I'm familiar with what it is. Of course, there's that sort of the sensory of noise and people touching microphones and other objects to lure people in and calm them down. Evoke a reaction.
Yeah, and they're like, I watch a whole lot of them. They like the ASMR painting. A lot of them are like some sort of role playing with doctors' offices, or like getting your hair cut, going to the dentist, tarot card readings. There's like this sort of like production, and I'm glad you like identified that as like having an element, like a queer element to it, or a level of like a different kind of intimacy, if that makes sense, like even a different type of physical intimacy. But yeah, I need a better microphone for it. But it's like this whisper, and it's like, hi, today, and it's like today we're gonna be giving you a haircut.
Yeah.
Come on in. And there's like this tingle, and like the tingle happens from the sound. Apparently not like some people are more susceptible to it than others. And that's what I guess like that's what hypnosis is too. Like some people are ready to be hypnotized. And I think part of what's so scary, first of all, I will admit openly, I react to ASMR videos like really and there's like there's a bodily an embodied element to it for me. Like I'm not a fan of them. I don't watch them all the time. It kind of seems like almost like watching porn. Like it feels like I'm watching porn when I watch them.
I would argue it is.
Yeah, that probably tells you a little bit of what I'm getting from it, which is like I'm feeling a deep feeling of comfort, and you want to get into like the master slave element of it. It's like fucking giving yourself over to someone else who's in control, and there's something really something very profoundly appealing about that for, I guess, certain people. And I think that's part of why, just from like a personal level, Cure is a film that just blew my mind because it worked on me. Like I'm scared. I'm scared of Mamiya because I'm scared that I'm susceptible to this. That someone is going to someone could very easily, I think, put me in a room and talk to me quietly and like convince me of certain things or make me feel a certain way and put me into like sort of this other position. And I don't know what to do with that. I'm kind of feel like I'm like laying out some TMI. If we're doing acronyms here at the end, I'm telling a little bit of my weakness. Now I know that someone's going to try to mesmerize me because they know I have this. But that's what I'm getting at is sort of like, why are films and why is visual media and why is like visual media combined with audio so powerful? It locks into a desire that many of us, I would argue all of us have to one degree or another, to sort of like give ourselves over to our deeper self, and maybe having like some sort of guide that holds our hand through that process is something we desire. This film is a lot about desire, right? And like
absolutely.
Deep, dark desires, and how subtle and how nuanced this film is. We said, I think you and I were texting before we started this recording today, Andrew, that like a filmmaker like Nolan, like Christopher Nolan, couldn't make something like Cure. It exists in a different register. And that's not to like shit on Nolan and say one is better than the other. It's more to say that like they're different projects. And I don't think there are a lot of filmmakers like Kiyoshi Kurosawa. I think what he's doing is something very different in terms of engaging, tropes of detective movies and horror films, but doing so in a way that delivers a very, very thoughtful and compelling and endlessly terrifying idea of what lies within. And God, I will be watching Cure for the rest of my life because it feels like something really deeply important. That's the best I can do for Cure.
No, that's a fantastic way to wrap this conversation up. And I would just gesture that I think Kurosawa is intentional, that when we see Takabe sort of succumb to the cure, if we want to call it that.
Right.
He's sitting in front of what I believe is a sonogram or a sonophone or I forget what they're called, the phonograph.
It's a phonograph, yeah.
It's a phonograph, and it says Edison on it, and one can assume that it probably is made under the patent of Thomas Edison. Who better to sort of represent sort of unbridled capitalism than Thomas Edison? And I think with someone as intentional as Kurosawa, it's hard to maybe miss, or maybe I don't want to project too much onto that or the intention of what that is. But my read there, and especially as someone who created the first film studio in the world, I believe Thomas Edison did, in New Jersey, the Black Maria, I believe it was called.
Yeah.
Which sort of, looking at a picture of it reminds me of sort of that barn in the film, that wooden sort of...
it looks like the kind of place you like kill pigs or torture people in.
Yeah. I couldn't tell whether that structure was real or whether it was in their minds, whether it was on another plane of existence, and we could sort of ponder these things maybe another time. given the fact that all the scenes with his wife on the bus sort of literally take place in what seems to be the clouds in another dimension.
So amazing. Those shots are so amazing on the bus. And yeah, that phonograph could have said Zuckerberg on it, you know? Like, it's sort of like this guy's getting pilled by technology. And again, I recommend that people watch Pulse. You can actually rent it on Amazon. I paid $4 for it because I had to see it. But Pulse is a film that is similar to Cure and playing with similar things, and it's really, really scary. If you're scared by movies, it'll scare the shit out of you. But it's about the internet, and it's about the internet that I recall falling in love with, which is like the late '90s, early 2000s internet with like chat rooms and stuff like that, webcams, really the beginnings of what's going to become the nightmare. But one of the things the character says to another that maybe we can sort of end on this note is one of them says, "Well, when did you get into the internet?" And he said, I don't know, I just got into it, you know, because everyone else seemed to be doing it. And she says, oh, were you looking to connect with people? And he said, yeah, I guess so. I was looking to connect with people. And she says, none of this connects us, though. We're all alone. And I just thought, like, God, the fact that he puts the thoughts that came up in this conversation between you and I about Cure are said a little bit more explicitly in Pulse. And I think that's somewhat to the film's detriment in some way, because it's like, so it's so on the nose and so stated about what it's about. But God, watch Pulse, and I think you start to think about Cure as we're on the right track, and thinking about Kurosawa as a filmmaker that's intervening on technology in some way, and our ability to be mesmerized, and technology being some sort of weapon in that war is something it's hard not to look around in 2021 and think that was a prophetic sort of engagement.
Well said.
Thank you, Andrew. This was really fun.
Pleasure.
You mentioned Tarkovsky's Stalker. I know you watched that one recently. That's another one that we should get into, because that movie is there's so much to say. So maybe we can. I don't want to commit you to that right now, but maybe
another film about faith.
Yeah, come back and think about Stalker, because I know a lot of people, like, you know, the young left folk are big Tarkovsky fans, and we did come and see, and I think the sort of like the idea of like Soviet films, and Soviet films coming out of those like sacrifice zones that Justin talks about. Yeah, there's a lot going on there, and it feels like Japan in the 90s is that place too, you know, and so. The idea of a kind of like irradiated landscape, whether literally or otherwise, is something that we talk about a lot on Nostalgia Trap, in part because it feels like that's what we're in the United States, and like that what we're going to live through in American life is like entering into the zone, if that makes sense. So we'll save that for next time. Thanks, Andrew. Always good to talk to you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, okay, I think that's going to wrap it up for us today. I want to thank my guest, Andrew Schustek, for watching this film and thinking about it with me. Go see Cure. I cannot recommend it enough, and I'd love to hear what you guys think about it. So sound off in the comments. And if you want to subscribe to our program, you can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We've got tons of bonus episodes, including tons of conversations about movies, pop culture, etc. And we're having a good time over there. So please join us at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.